Racist woman refuses to let Keanu Reeves sit on the subway, faces public backlash. What happened next shocked everyone. Where are you tuning in from? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. In New York City, back in 2017, a moment on the subway involving Hollywood icon Keanu Reeves left commuters stunned. It was a typical October evening in the city that never sleeps, the subway bustling with people eager to get home. Among them was Keanu, casually dressed in a black jacket, jeans, and a low-pulled beanie. Despite his fame, he preferred to stay grounded, moving quietly through the crowd. As the train left Union Square, Keanu scanned the packed car for a seat and noticed one beside an older woman, her silver hair and pearls reflecting the dim subway light. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said kindly, motioning to the empty spot. The woman barely glanced at him before snapping, "That seat's taken," while clutching her purse tightly. Several passengers recognized him instantly, exchanging whispers. Unfazed, Keanu stepped back with a small smile and softly said, "I'm sorry." Before he could move away, a young woman across the aisle stood up, her voice loud and clear. "You can have my seat," she said, casting a sharp look at the older woman. Keanu hesitated, but began moving toward her offer when the older woman muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Probably homeless. Looks like one of them." The air in the subway car grew thick as passengers fell silent. Keanu paused mid-step. For a moment, it seemed he might let the comment slide, but instead, he turned back. His expression was calm, though his eyes revealed something deeper. "You shouldn't judge people so quickly," he said, his voice measured yet firm. "You don't know what they've been through." The tension in the car broke as a man nearby chimed in. "Lady, do you even know who this is? That's Keanu Reeves, the nicest guy in Hollywood." Other voices followed, sharing stories. "He's donated millions to cancer research. He takes the subway like the rest of us. He once paid for my groceries." The woman's face turned crimson, but she remained silent. Meanwhile, Keanu thanked the young woman for her kindness and opted to stand, gripping the overhead rail. What happened next etched itself into the memories of everyone present. The subway car rattled forward, silent except for the occasional clatter of the train. A young girl in a pink hoodie tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mommy, isn't that the man from the movies?" Her voice shattered the tension, drawing soft chuckles from the passengers. Keanu glanced at the girl, his features softening. "Yeah, that's me," he said warmly, flashing her a kind smile. The little girl lit up, but the older woman's frown deepened. "Actors think they're so special," she grumbled, just loud enough to be heard. This time, Keanu didn't brush it off. He met her gaze, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion. "I wasn't always an actor," he began. "I know what it feels like to be judged by appearances. I know what it's like to lose everything and still have to keep going." The subway slowed as it neared the next station, but no one moved. Every eye remained fixed on Keanu. "My dad left when I was just 3, he continued, his voice tinged with sorrow. "I lost my best friend when we were 23. My daughter died before she could even take her first breath. And my partner," his voice faltered briefly, "she died in a car accident. I held her hand in the hospital, promising I'd never stop loving her, even as the machines went silent." Gasps rippled through the car as tears welled in the eyes of many. The older woman looked stunned, her mouth slightly open, as though searching for words. Keanu drew a deep breath, composing himself, and the subway rolled forward into the night, carrying a story none of its passengers would ever forget. When you see someone and think you understand their struggles, their pain, or their losses, pause for a moment. A small act of kindness can cost you nothing but may be the very thing that gives someone hope to keep going. Tears brimmed in the eyes of several passengers, including the young woman who had kindly given up her seat earlier. Even the older woman, whose earlier words had been sharp, seemed to shrink under the weight of his message. She opened her mouth, but no harsh remark came out at this time. Instead, in a trembling voice, she said, "I'm sorry." Keanu nodded, accepting her apology without hesitation. As the train rolled into the next station, the unexpected happened. A man wearing a faded jacket and shoes that had seen better days stepped aboard. His eyes landed on Keanu, and he froze in place. "Johnny?" he asked, using Keanu's middle name in a way that suggested familiarity. Though faint, the resemblance between them was unmistakable. Keanu's grip on the handrail tightened. "David," he whispered, barely audible. The tension on the train shifted instantly from judgment to something far more profound, something rooted in years gone by. The subway doors slid open with a hiss, but no one moved. The man who had just entered remained motionless, his gaze locked on Keanu. The bustling train car suddenly felt smaller, quieter, as if the entire city had paused to bear witness. "David?" Keanu repeated, his voice unsteady. His knuckles whitened as he clung to the rail. The man's lips quivered, tears filling his eyes. "It's me, Johnny," he said, using a childhood nickname few still remembered. "It's your brother." Gasps rippled through the passengers, but Keanu seemed oblivious. His shoulders stiffened, memories crashing over him like waves. Memories he had spent years trying to bury. "You," Keanu said, his voice faltering, "you left." David took a cautious step forward, his worn clothes and weathered face betraying years of hardship. "I didn't mean to," David said softly. "I was scared." Keanu's voice grew tight as he cut him off. "After Dad left, you ran." The train lurched forward, but Keanu's grip on the rail remained firm. The crowd around them held their breath, the air thick with tension. Some exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if they were witnessing a reunion or another heartbreak. David looked down, shame clouding his face. "I know," he said quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I've been searching for you for years." Keanu's jaw clenched, old wounds pressing against his resolve. For so long he had carried the pain of losing his family, a scar hidden but never healed. Now, standing before him was David, weathered by time, but alive. The older woman, who had refused him a seat earlier, sat motionless, her eyes darting between the brothers. The weight of the moment made her shift uncomfortably, guilt etched across her face. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. "And I never blamed you for leaving," Keanu said finally, his voice softer now. "I blame myself for not being enough to make you stay." David's eyes filled with tears. "No, Johnny," he said, his voice breaking. "You were always enough. I just didn't know how to face life after Mom died." The words lingered in the air, fragile and delicate. Keanu released the rail and stepped closer. For a moment it seemed as though he might push David away, but instead he pulled him into an embrace. The train car filled with quiet sniffles as passengers wiped their eyes. Even the older woman bowed her head, regret and shame written across her expression. David clung to Keanu, his shoulders shaking. "I thought you'd never forgive me," he said through tears. Keanu held him tighter. "We've both lost too much already," Keanu whispered. "I'm not losing you again." The train slowed as it approached the next station. The older woman suddenly stood, turning to face Keanu. Her voice wavered as she said, I'm sorry for how I treated you earlier. I was wrong." Keanu gave her a small nod. "Thank you," he said gently. Just before the doors opened, the woman reached into her purse and pulled out a folded photograph. Her hands trembled as she offered it to him. "This is my son," she said softly. "He passed away last year." Cancer Keanu's expression softened as he took the picture. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely audible. She wiped her eyes with trembling hands. "I realize now how much kindness matters. I just pray it's not too late for me to change." The train screeched to a stop, but no one moved to exit. The air felt heavy, thick with the emotions of stories untold, as if time itself had paused. As the doors began to close, David hesitated, his voice shaking. "Johnny, there's something I need to tell you, something about why I left." Keanu's heart pounded as the doors slid shut. Whatever David was about to reveal seemed like it could alter everything. The train began moving again, but the sound felt distant, like static in the background. Keanu's chest tightened as he locked eyes with David, searching for answers to questions he'd buried for years. David's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn envelope. "I've carried this with me for years," he said, his voice hoarse. "I wasn't sure I'd ever have the courage to give it to you." Keanu hesitated, then took the envelope. It felt fragile, its edges soft and worn from too many hands. Inside, he found an old photograph of two boys laughing on a rusted swing set, their smiles carefree, untouched by the storms life would bring. Scrawled on the back were the words, "For Johnny, no matter how far I go, I'll always come back." Keanu's throat tightened as he looked at David. "Why now?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper. David's eyes brimmed with tears. "Because I almost didn't make it back." A hush fell over the train. Even the older woman who'd earlier insulted Keanu leaned forward, her expression softening. "I got caught up with the wrong crowd after I left," David admitted, his voice filled with regret. "I thought I could handle it, but I lost everything. Money, friends, my home. I spent years on the streets, too ashamed to ask for help." His voice broke, and he wiped his face with his sleeve. "Then I got sick." Keanu's heart sank. "Sick?" David nodded. "Cancer, stage 3. Gasps echoed through the train car. Keanu grabbed the rail to steady himself, his legs weak. "You didn't tell me?" Keanu's voice cracked. "I couldn't," David replied. "I thought it was too late. But then I saw you on TV one night. It hit me. I had to find you before it was over. I had to fix this." Tears streaked Keanu's face, but he didn't wipe them away. "You're not dying," he said, his voice firm but trembling. "You can't be." David tried to smile but faltered. "I'm fighting, Johnny, every single day, but I can't do it alone anymore." The older woman stood, her eyes swollen with tears. She clutched a photo of her son and stepped closer. "No one should have to fight alone," she said, her voice shaking. For the first time, Keanu looked at her, not with anger, but with understanding. She had her own scars. The young woman, who had given up her seat earlier, reached into her purse, pulling out a tissue for David. "I don't know you," she said gently, "but I understand what it's like to need someone to believe in you." David looked at the strangers surrounding him, witnessing his vulnerability. His shoulders trembled. "I don't deserve this kindness," he whispered. Keanu stepped closer, wrapping an arm around his brother. "You do," he said firmly. "You're not alone this time." The train slowed as it neared the next station, but no one made a move to leave. The car was silent, filled with a shared sense of forgiveness, love, and humanity. As the doors opened, Keanu turned to David. "Let's get you the help you need." David nodded, but paused, turning to the older woman. "Thank you," he said softly. Her lips quivered. "No," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for reminding me what it means to care." The doors slid shut, and the train moved on, carrying with it the echoes of pain, forgiveness, and hope. But for Keanu and David, it was just the start of their battle. Outside the subway station, the air was sharp and cold, but Keanu hardly noticed. He stayed close to David, steadying him as they stepped onto the sidewalk. The weight of the moment pressed on them, but there was an unspoken resolve. They were beginning a journey neither could have anticipated. David glanced at Keanu as if afraid he might vanish. "I can't believe this is real," he said, his voice raw. Keanu stopped and turned to him. "It's real," he said firmly. "You're here, and I'm not letting go this time." David looked down, shame flickering across his face. "I don't deserve this." Keanu shook his head. "Stop saying that." His voice broke, and David saw the pain Keanu had carried. "You're my brother. That's all that matters." David's eyes filled with tears, but he wiped them away quickly. "You don't have to hold it together right now," Keanu said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been strong long enough." As they resumed walking, David suddenly faltered, his legs giving out beneath him. Keanu reacted instantly, catching him just in time. "Hey, hey," he said, his voice trembling with concern. "Are you okay?" David nodded faintly, but his pale complexion told a different story. "I'm just tired," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I haven't eaten much lately." Keanu's chest tightened. Without a second thought, he flagged down a taxi and helped his brother inside. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, ignoring David's feeble objections. The ride was tense, filled only with the hum of the cab's engine and the occasional sound of David's labored breathing. Keanu stared out the window, lost in memories. He thought of Christmas mornings without their father, the nights spent holding David close after their mother passed, and the promises they had made to always stand by each other, promises that had been broken. But not anymore. Keanu was determined to make things right. When they arrived at the hospital, nurses quickly surrounded David, easing him into a wheelchair. Keanu followed closely, his heart pounding as medical forms were thrust into his hands. Words like urgent care and critical condition swirled around him, but none of it felt real. Hours blurred together as he sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes fixed on the clock. The subway scene replayed in his mind, the young woman who had offered her seat, the older lady who'd apologized, the quiet tears of strangers who had witnessed something unspoken. Suddenly, approaching footsteps broke his trance. Keanu looked up to see the older woman from the subway standing before him, holding a small bouquet of flowers. "I wasn't sure I'd find you here," she said nervously, clutching the blooms. "But I had to try." Keanu blinked, startled. "You didn't have to come," he said softly. "Yes, I did," she replied, her voice cracking. "Seeing you and your brother made me realize how much I've taken for granted. How many people I've pushed away, like my son." She paused, her voice faltering. "I never told him how proud I was before he passed, and now it's too late." Now, Keanu swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "It's not too late for you to be proud of yourself," he said gently. "You're here now. That matters." Tears streamed down her face, but this time she let them fall freely. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for reminding me it's never too late to change." Before Keanu could respond, a nurse appeared at his side. "Mr. Reeves," she said, her tone cautious. He stood abruptly. "Is he okay?" The nurse hesitated. "He's stable for now, but the cancer is advanced. He'll need immediate treatment, and it's going to be a tough road." Keanu felt the weight of her words threaten to buckle his knees, but he steadied himself. "Do whatever it takes," he said, his voice resolute. Moments later, David was wheeled out, his face pale and exhausted, yet his eyes glimmered faintly with hope. Keanu knelt beside him, gripping his hand tightly. "I'm not leaving," he said firmly. "Not now, not ever." David tried to muster a smile, but broke down instead, burying his face in Keanu's shoulder as sobs racked his frail body. From a distance, the older woman watched silently, clutching the bouquet she had brought. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer for forgiveness, for healing, and for the chance to set things right. But this wasn't the end. It was only the start of a journey that would test the resilience of love, family, and forgiveness in ways they couldn't foresee. Under the hospital's sterile fluorescent lights, Keanu sat beside David's bed, his hand resting lightly on his brother's frail fingers. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was a sobering reminder of how precious time truly was. David stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "You're still here," he whispered weakly. Keanu leaned in closer. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." David's lips quivered as tears welled in his eyes. "I don't deserve this," he murmured, the guilt in his voice piercing through Keanu. "Stop," Keanu said, his voice cracking. "You're my brother David. That's all that matters." David let out a shaky breath, his tears spilling over. "I was so scared, Johnny. After Mum died, I was terrified of losing you too. I didn't know how to keep going, so I ran, and I've regretted it every single day since." Keanu gripped his brother's hand tighter, his own tears falling freely. For the first time in years, they were beginning to mend the broken pieces of their bond together. Keanu felt a tightness in his chest. "You never lost me," he murmured. "I was always here, waiting for you to come back." David exhaled shakily, and for the first time in years, the barriers between them collapsed. The anger, regret, and guilt melted away, leaving only the unvarnished truth of their bond as brothers. Quietly, the older woman from the subway entered the room, clutching the bouquet of flowers she'd brought earlier. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but there was a new softness in her expression. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said gently. Keanu shook his head. "Not at all." She stepped closer, placing the flowers on the bedside table. "I wanted to say something," she began, her voice trembling. "That day on the train, I judged you unfairly and it was wrong. But seeing you and your brother reminded me of my son." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "I pushed him away with my pride and bitterness. And when he got sick, I didn't know how to fix things. By the time I had the courage to try, it was too late." David's gaze softened. "I'm sorry for your loss." She shook her head. "Don't be. Watching you two has given me hope. Hope that maybe it's not too late for me to change, to honor my son by living better." Keanu rose and walked toward her, resting a kind hand on her shoulder. "It's never too late," he said warmly. "Not for any of us." The older woman wiped her tears and offered a faint smile before turning to leave. "Thank you," she said, "for showing me what forgiveness looks like." As the door clicked shut behind her, David squeezed Keanu's hand. "Do you really believe that? That it's never too late?" David asked. Keanu nodded. "I do, and we'll prove it together." The months that followed blurred into a whirlwind of hospital visits, treatments, and countless prayers. Keanu stayed by David's side, sleeping in uncomfortable hospital chairs and rescheduling film shoots to be there when it mattered most. Lily, the young woman from the subway who had once offered Keanu her seat, became a frequent visitor. Over time, she became more than just a friend. She brought warm meals, shared funny stories, and managed to brighten their darkest days. Slowly but steadily, David's health improved. The road to recovery was long and arduous, but he fought harder than anyone had dared to hope. One sunny day, as golden light streamed through the hospital window, David turned to Keanu with a soft smile. "I don't think I'd still be here without you," he said quietly. Keanu squeezed his hand firmly. "You're not going anywhere. We've got too much to make up for." David's eyes glistened with unshed tears, not of sorrow but of gratitude and hope. In that moment, Keanu knew their journey wasn't merely about loss or regret. It was about forgiveness, love, and the resilience to heal even the deepest wounds with time and courage. Outside the hospital, the older woman stood near the entrance, clutching a letter she'd written to her late son. She smiled softly, accepting she couldn't undo the past, but could still honor his memory by choosing kindness and compassion moving forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, it didn't signify an ending but a new beginning for Keanu, for David, and for everyone touched by their story.